The Bone People, styled by the writer and in some editions as The Bone People, is a 1984 novel by New Zealand writer Keri Hulme. Set on the coast of the South Island of New Zealand, the novel focuses on three characters, all of whom are isolated in different ways: a reclusive artist, a mute child, and the child's foster father. Over the course of the novel, the trio develop a tentative relationship, are driven apart by violence, and reunite. Maori and Pākehā, New Zealand European culture, myths and language are blended through the novel. The novel has polarized critics and readers, with some praising the novel for its power and originality, while others have criticized Hulme's writing style and portrayals of violence. Keri Ann Ruhi Hulme, 9 March 1947 to 27 December 2021, was a New Zealand novelist, poet and short story writer. She also wrote under the pen name Kai Tainui. Her novel The Bone People won the Booker Prize in 1985. She was the first New Zealander to win the award, and also the first writer to win the prize for their debut novel. Hulme's writing explores themes of isolation, post-colonial and multicultural identity, and Maori, Celtic, and Norse mythology. Hulme spent many years working on the novel, but was unable to find a mainstream publisher who was willing to accept the book without significant editing. It was eventually published by the small all-women collective of Spiral. After initial commercial success in New Zealand, the book was published overseas and became the first New Zealand novel and first debut novel to win the Booker Prize in 1985. Although not without controversy, 2 of the 5 judges opposed the book's choice for its portrayals of child abuse and violence. Nevertheless, the novel has remained popular into the 21st century, continuing to sell well in New Zealand and overseas, and is widely recognized as a New Zealand literary classic. Summary. Kerwin lives in a tower overlooking the sea on the coast of the South Island. She is isolated from her family and interacts little with the local community, but is able to live independently after winning a lottery and investing well. On a stormy afternoon, a young child, Simon, appears at the tower. He is mute and communicates with Kerwin through hand signals and notes. He is picked up the next morning by a family friend. Later that evening, Simon's foster father, Joe, visits Kerwin to thank her for looking after Simon. After a freak storm years earlier, Simon was found washed up on the beach with very few clues as to his identity. Despite Simon's mysterious background, Joe and his wife Hannah took the boy in. Later, Joe's infant son and Hannah both died, forcing Joe to bring the troubled and troublesome Simon up on his own. Kerwin finds herself developing a tentative relationship with the boy and his father. Gradually it becomes clear that Simon is a deeply traumatized child, whose strange behaviors Joe is unable to cope with. Kerwin discovers that, in spite of the real familial love between them, Joe is physically abusing Simon. Horrified, she initially says nothing to Joe, but suggests they travel to her family's Bach holiday home by the beach for a break. Early on in their stay, she confronts Joe and asks him to go easier on Simon. Joe and Kerwin argue, and after Simon spits at Joe, she intervenes to stop Joe from beating him, using her Aikido skills. Following the incident, Joe promises not to beat Simon without her permission. They spend the rest of their time at the beach fishing, talking and drinking. After returning home from the holiday, Simon sees the aftermath of a violent death and seeks Kerwin out for support, but she is angry with him for stealing one of her prized possessions. Simon reacts by punching her. She instinctively hits him in the chest, and in response he kicks in the side of her guitar, a gift from her estranged mother. Kerwin tells him to get out. Simon goes to the town and breaks a series of shop windows, and when he is returned home by the police, Joe calls Kerwin, who gives Joe permission to beat the child but tells him not to overdo it. Joe beats Simon severely, believing he has driven Kerwin away. Simon, who has concealed a shard of glass from a shop window, stabs his father. Both are hospitalized, with Simon falling into a coma. Joe is released quickly but sent to prison for 3 months for child abuse, and in the meantime Kerwin leaves town and demolishes her tower. Simon eventually recovers, albeit with some loss of hearing and brain damage, and is sent to live in foster care against his wishes. He is unhappy and continually runs away, trying to get back to Joe and Keri. After Joe's release from prison, he travels aimlessly. He jumps off a cliff and nearly kills himself, but is rescued by undying Kaumachua, a respected elder who says he has been waiting for Joe. He asks Joe to take over guardianship of a sacred waka canoe containing the spirit of a god, which Joe accepts. In the meantime, Keri becomes seriously ill with stomach pains. Although she visits a doctor who says he is concerned it may be stomach cancer, she refuses to allow him to investigate further and insists he write her a prescription for sleeping pills. After several weeks in a mountain cabin, on the point of death, she is visited by a spirit of some kind and cured. Keri returns to her community and takes custody of Simon. Joe also returns, bringing with him the sacred spirit. Without Keri's knowledge or permission, he contacts Keri's family, resulting in a joyous reconciliation. The final scene of the novel depicts the reunion of Keri, Simon and Joe, celebrating with family and friends back at the beach where Keri has rebuilt the old Marae communal meeting house not as a tower but in the shape of a shell with many spirals. The novel focuses on three main characters, all of whom are isolated in different ways. In the short prologue at the start of the novel, the then unnamed characters are described as nothing more than people by themselves, but together, the hearts and muscles and mind of something perilous and new, the instruments of change. The three characters are Keri Holmes. Keri lives in an isolated tower by the sea, estranged from her family and community. She is part Maori, part Pakeha, and asexual. She is skilled, knowledgeable and creative, but although seeing herself as a painter finds herself unable to paint. At the outset of the novel she spends her days fishing and drinking. She is often preparing food or eating, which links the novel to traditional Maori storytelling themes of food and its preparation. She has been described as a clear stand-in for the author. Hulme said that Holmes began as an alter ego character but escaped out of my control and developed a life of her own. Simon P. Gillely. Simon is a mute child, aged 6 or 7, with an immense interest in details of the world around him. Simon has a deep attachment to both Joe and Keri, but he shows his love in odd ways. He exhibits a disregard for personal property. He is isolated from others by his inability to speak, and others mistake his muteness for stupidity. His life before meeting Joe is never described in detail, although it is hinted that he was abused before meeting Joe. He is Pakeha, with blonde hair and blue eyes. Joe Gillely. Joe is Simon's foster father. His alcoholism clouds his judgment, particularly in his raising of Simon, who he physically abuses. Joe seems to both love and respect Keri, but also to compete with her. He is deeply scarred and isolated by the death of his wife and infant child, and is disconnected from his Maori heritage. The relationship between these three troubled characters is characterized by violence and difficulty in communicating. Violence, pain and suffering appear frequently in the novel, most notably through Joe's beating of Simon, but also through the character's spiritual pain and isolation. Both Keri and Joe are estranged from their Maori heritage and identity, and both have lost their families. All three characters experience near-death experiences over the course of the novel. Some critics have described Simon as a Christ-like figure in his suffering and his salvation of Joe and Keri, although Hulme herself has rejected this comparison, saying, none of his suffering is for anyone else. Over the course of the novel the three characters bond and become the Bone People. In Maori, the term iwi, usually referring to a tribal group, literally means bone. Thus, in the novel, Simon imagines Joe saying the phrase, "Ina iwi o na iwi," which the book's glossary explains. It means, "Oh the bones of the people," where bones stands for ancestors or relations, or, "Oh the people of the bones," i.e. the beginning people, the people who make another people. Each character represents aspects of New Zealand's racial culture. Through their love of Simon and acceptance of Maori myth into their lives, Jo and Keri are able to transform themselves. 20. The Oxford Companion to New Zealand Literature describes the three as becoming a new multicultural group, founded on Maori spirituality and traditional ritual, who offer transformative hope to a country stunted by the violence of its divided colonial legacy. The relationship between Jo and Keri is not a sexual one, although Jo does consider Keri as a possible partner, and the two form a close bond that is akin to a romantic relationship or a parental one with Simon. At the end of the book, Jo and Simon take her last name, not for sentimental reasons but for what Keri describes as good legal sense. Critic C.K. Stead has said he considers this to be the imaginative strength of the work. That it creates a sexual union where no sex occurs, creates parental love where there are no physical parents, creates the stress and fusion of a family where there is no actual family. The spiral form frequently appears as a symbol throughout the novel, and is linked to the koru as an old symbol of rebirth in Maori culture. An early review by New Zealand writer and academic Peter Simpson noted how particularly apt it was for the book to have been published by the Spiral Collective, because the spiral form is central to the novel's meaning and design. It is in effect the code of the work, informing every aspect from innumerable local details to the overall structure. It represents the sense of community, cultural integration and open-endedness that gives the characters hope at the end of the novel. The novel is divided into 4 sections of 3 parts each, loosely covering the 4 seasons of a year. Much of the narration is from the perspective of Keri, and predominantly in the third person, but some sections are told from the perspective of Jo or Simon, including those sections which relate to Jo's violent beating of Simon. The prose is often in a stream of consciousness or poetic style, denoting characters' inner thoughts. It also incorporates use of the Maori language, usually untranslated in the text, but with a glossary at the back of the book. The novel frequently features the dreams of the 3 characters, and in the final section the narrative shifts from realism to mysticism. The Oxford Companion to New Zealand Literature observes that the novel requires active concentration from the reader, given the mixture of poetry and prose, New Zealand slang and Maori phrases, realistic and supernatural elements, and tonal shifts from ordinary and banal to lyrical and sacred. Judith Dale, in a review for Landfall, describes Hulme's writing as highly idiosyncratic, often florid, with a wide lexical range. The book abounds with literary allusions, arcane references and a self-conscious use of language that depends on wide and esoteric reading. Marita Mita describes the writing as reminiscent of musical patterns in jazz. The novel's popularity has endured into the 21st century. In 2004, it remained in the New Zealand fiction bestseller list. In 2005, a public conference was held at the Stout Research Centre at Victoria University of Wellington to mark 20 years since the Booker Prize win. In 2006, the novel was voted New Zealand's favourite book in a public poll as part of the inaugural NZ Book Month. In 2018, it came third in 2 separate polls by the spin-off of the favourite New Zealand books of readers and literary experts respectively. It is the favourite novel of New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. In 2022, it was included on the Big Jubilee Read list of 70 books by Commonwealth authors selected to celebrate the Platinum Jubilee of Elizabeth II.